In the dead of night over Nazi-occupied France, an Allied B-24 Liberator bomber hums through the darkness. Yet this is no ordinary mission. This Liberator, painted black from nose to tail, must fly completely alone, with no squadron mates and no fighter escort for protection. Radio communication has been strictly forbidden. Strangest of all, she's been completely stripped of her bombs. In their place, she carries radio equipment, carrier pigeons, folding motorcycles, medical supplies, and a mysterious pair of operatives known to the aircraft's crew only as Joe and Josephine. Spotting an unusual grouping of 4 tiny lights in a clearing in the forest up ahead, the pilot swoops down as low as he can until the Liberator barely skims the treetops. The crew exchange nervous glances. Somewhere below, the resistance is waiting, and so too might the Gestapo. But the success of D-Day depends on this dangerous delivery. In the fall of 1943, Allied forces were pushing through Italy and preparing for the liberation of Western Europe. But on the other side of the Atlantic, in a nondescript cluster of what appeared to be regular government offices and apartment blocks, a very different kind of war was being planned. Known as the E Street Complex, this unassuming Washington, D.C. location was, in reality, the base of operations for the Office of Strategic Services, the United States' first centralized intelligence agency, the brainchild of William J. Donovan. Known as Wild Bill, Donovan was a World War I Medal of Honor hero who'd spent the 1930s traveling extensively across Europe and Asia as an informal intelligence gatherer, building relationships with foreign leaders and observing the rise of fascism firsthand. Convinced that America needed a centralized intelligence service to compete with Britain's MI6 and Germany's Abwehr, he persuaded President Roosevelt to create the OSS in 1942. The OSS quickly established a reputation for daring missions behind enemy lines, working closely with resistance movements across Nazi-occupied Europe. But now, with operations scaling up significantly in preparation for D-Day, Donovan and his operatives faced a critical challenge. Across the continent's occupied territories, resistance fighters would need greater numbers than ever before, of weapons, ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies, and trained agents who could organize sabotage operations and coordinate intelligence. The problem was getting these supplies and agents to their destinations. Submarine drops were limited and dangerous. Overland infiltration was nearly impossible through Hitler's fortress of Europe. With sea and land off the table, only one option remained: the sky. At first, the idea seemed difficult to fathom. What would become known as Operation Carpetbagger would be an extremely daring undertaking. Each mission would begin with coded BBC broadcasts, seemingly innocent messages such as "the postman is late" or "grandmother sends her love," which would alert resistance cells across occupied Europe to prepare for incoming drops. Then, a lone B-24 bomber would take off from England and fly for hundreds of miles into the heart of Nazi-controlled territory to deliver supplies and agents who would be known to the crew only as Joes and Josephines. In the middle of the night, the bombers would thread a dangerous path between German radar installations and anti-aircraft batteries that ringed the European coastline. Once past these defenses, they would drop to altitudes as low as 500 feet to stay below German radar coverage, flying through a landscape bristling with searchlights, airfields full of night fighters, and thousands of soldiers who might report the sound of aircraft engines. Radio silence would be absolute. Any transmission could be intercepted and triangulated by German direction-finding equipment, bringing swift and deadly retaliation. At the target area, the real challenge would begin. In a countryside that looked identical from the air, the crew would search for a small group of resistance fighters in a vast expanse of fields and forests. The drop zone would be marked only by a pattern of flashlights, typically 3 in a row, with a fourth positioned at a right angle to indicate wind direction. Miss this tiny signal in the darkness, and the precious supplies would fall into enemy hands. Find it, and the crew would have just minutes to complete their drop at speed slow enough to prevent the parachutes from tearing, before climbing back into the night sky for the long journey home. With the risks involved, it was far from ideal, but the combined chiefs of staff decided it was the best option for ensuring the success of their upcoming invasion of Western Europe. Now, they needed to find men capable of taking on such a perilous task. In late 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force disbanded its anti-submarine command. Among the units affected were the 22nd Anti-Submarine Squadron, based at RAF Alconbury in Cambridgeshire. The squadron's aircraft and crews had spent months flying long, lonely patrols across the vast Atlantic Ocean and had become experts in low-level flying, dead-reckoning navigation across featureless expanses, and precision operations under pressure. Exactly the skill set now required for something far more secretive than hunting U-boats. The squadron's personnel and aircraft were reassigned into two squadrons, the 36th and 406th, under the 482nd Bombardment Group, who would form the backbone of the force assembled to carry out Operation Carpetbagger. Meanwhile, other men were recruited from conventional bombing units. Due to the classified nature of the missions, candidates were told just enough information about what would be required of them. Gunner Bill Becker later recalled, quote, "They tried to keep it as secret as possible, and they didn't want any of this stuff to leak out. In fact, when we first joined this organization, they told us what we were going to do. We were going to fly at night, during the moonlight. We were going to 400 feet above the ground. If we didn't want to do that, we could walk out immediately, and they would transfer us to daylight bombing." Becker and his comrades had to make a difficult decision. He remembered, quote, "The whole crew got together at that particular briefing and said, 'Should we do it?' And we all said, 'Yeah, let's do it.' However, they were given a strict warning, quote, 'If we went to town and mentioned anything about it, they would bring us back and we would get shot.' That's how secret it was." As the crews assembled on base, they were surprised to find that the aircraft they would be flying were in the middle of an unusual transformation. They would watch in fascination as their familiar silver B-24 Liberators disappeared under coats of glossy black paint, hundreds of pounds of it per aircraft, as this would be the best color for evading German searchlights, allowing the bombers to blend into the night sky when crossing into occupied Europe. Yet the change of color was just the beginning. The aircraft were being stripped of their very identity as bombers. Gun turrets were removed, including the distinctive ball turret beneath the fuselage. In its place, engineers installed what would become known as the Joe hole, a cargo hatch through which supplies and secret agents would drop into enemy territory. Waist guns were replaced with blackout curtains. Special blisters were added to the cockpit windows to give pilots better visibility during their low-level night flights. While their aircraft were being converted into these ghostly night raiders, the men began training, learning the positions of the stars in the skies over Europe to help them navigate. They studied maps and aerial photographs of European terrain, memorizing the rivers, forests, and distinctive landmarks they would need to recognize from the cockpit during their nighttime journeys. The crews also had to learn to use cutting-edge navigation equipment, unlike anything they'd seen before. A directional air-ground device called Rebecca would guide navigators to ground operators using a companion device called Eureka. Meanwhile, each aircraft also carried an S-phone, a special two-way radio that would allow final coordination with resistance fighters on the ground, and crucially, verify that the people waiting below were actually partisans and not German troops laying a trap. In October 1943, the Carpetbaggers, as the crews became known, flew their first operational missions into enemy territory. Gunner Bob Holstrom explained that initially, rather than sending supplies or agents, they would drop, quote, leaflets in containers 6 feet long and 30 inches in circumference that had a barometric that would explode over 10,000 feet that spread the leaflets over miles. It was to help the European civilians know what was going on in the war, because radio reception was shoddy. These materials were designed to keep hope alive among conquered populations and spread news that German censors desperately tried to suppress. Flying at altitudes as low as 500 feet over hostile territory, navigating by starlight while German searchlights swept the darkness below, the crews gained invaluable experience with the routes, equipment, and nerve-wracking reality of threading their heavy bombers between enemy defenses. Every flight taught them something new about evading radar, reading the landscape in darkness, and coordinating their approach to drop zones. Most importantly, these missions proved that the concept could work, that specially modified bombers really could penetrate deep into occupied Europe and return safely. At the beginning of 1944, after a round of command shuffling, the Carpetbaggers were moved to RAF Tempsford in Bedfordshire and placed under a new provisional unit, the 801st Bombardment Group. Now they were ready to up the stakes. From January 4th onwards, they started delivering what the operation had really been designed to: vital supplies and OSS agents. The process of loading human cargo was shrouded in especially great secrecy. The Joes and Josephines were handled with extraordinary care by the OSS. After being received at Harrington by the armament officer, they would be kept hidden by his section until the time came to embark on the mission. Then the agents would be escorted to the runway with assistance from members of the British Special Operations Executive. Navigator Hewitt Gomez remembered, quote, "If we were transporting spies, I never saw them. We would taxi out on the runway, and a jeep would meet us with the individuals we were taking, and they would get aboard then." This last-minute procedure ensured that even the Carpetbagger crews knew as little as possible about the identities of the men and women they were carrying into enemy territory, a crucial security measure that protected both the agents and the resistance networks they would be joining. Meanwhile, the Carpetbagger's existence remained hidden from other units. Gomez recalled, quote, "You couldn't tell anyone where you were from. I ran into a high school classmate, and I told him I flew B-24s in the 1st Division. He said, 'There are no B-24s in the 1st Division. That's because we were secretly based.'" However, within the OSS itself, word was quickly spreading that the Carpetbagger concept was working, and the number of missions increased. Yet, on board the modified bombers, aircrews had to endure difficult conditions, with minimal space available. Another navigator, Eugene Polinsky, remembered, quote, "I was sitting on a gun case for every mission. My desk was a piece of wood that came down. That was it, and behind that piece of wood, there was the pilot's feet and the co-pilot's feet." Meanwhile, Hewitt Gomez described some of the other challenges of the missions, saying, quote, "There was no heater, and it was a non-pressurized cabin. Air was coming in through every opening. We flew in the rain and inclement weather. We wore lambskin-lined jackets and pants and heated electric blanket suits." He added, quote, "Sometimes we flew with a sandwich and an orange. The orange froze through and through like a baseball. The sandwich was crunchy." Upon reaching their targets, the crews never knew if they were flying into a trap, whether the resistance fighters waiting below were genuine, or if German forces had compromised the drop zones. Even when the black B-24s finally touched down at Harrington Field after their grueling missions, the crews still faced one final task before they could rest. They were driven directly to the intelligence library at the rear of the Group Operations Building, where S2 officers waited to conduct immediate debriefings. After providing every detail they could remember about their mission, the exhausted airmen were taken to the mess hall, where a medical officer supervised the distribution of a 2-ounce medicinal ration of whiskey or cognac to each crew member, a carefully controlled dose designed to relax their tense nerves after a long mission. Each man had to sign a receipt for his liquor, which was, quote, "issued for operational use only." Only then could they enjoy a hot breakfast of bacon and eggs, before finally heading to their billets for much-needed sleep. For those too wound up to rest after their ordeal, sedatives were available from the medical officer to help them cope with the psychological aftermath of another night spent flying through the heart of enemy territory. On April 5, 1944, the 801st Bombardment Group was moved to RAF Harrington, a remote airfield in the Northamptonshire countryside. This more secluded base would allow aircrews to operate with an even greater level of secrecy than before. Around the same time, Carpetbagger operations expanded dramatically. With D-Day drawing near, Allied planners knew that the success of the coming invasion would depend heavily on coordinated resistance activity behind German lines, and the Black B-24s would provide a vital link between Allied command and thousands of fighters preparing to strike at German communications and supply lines. As a result, in May 1944, the 801st was doubled in size, with 2 more squadrons added, the 788th and 850th. After the June 6 D-Day landings, the Carpetbaggers were flying at a pace that would have been unimaginable months earlier. In July 1944 alone, they completed 397 missions, dropping 4,680 containers, 2,909 packages, and 62 agents into enemy territory. The aircrews were pushed to their limits, sometimes flying multiple missions in a week as requests poured in from resistance groups across northern France. Gunner Robert Holstrom recalled, quote, "I flew 2 missions with pigeons. The pigeons were in a Quaker tubular container and had 3 days of food and the capsules and a pencil so patriots could put in their grocery order or whatever they needed." The carrier pigeons would then fly back to London and deliver their message a few days later. This traditional method allowed messages to be sent without using radio communication, which would be far more likely to be intercepted by the Germans. As the war progressed, the items sent to the resistance became more varied. including some surprising additions. The British had developed folding motorcycles specifically for resistance use, lightweight enough to parachute, but sturdy enough for rough terrain. Other containers held throwaway pistols, cheap, single-use weapons designed to be discarded after one assassination or sabotage operation. Medical supplies included not just bandages and morphine, but specialized surgical instruments for resistance doctors operating in hidden field hospitals. Some packages even included currency, diamonds, and jewelry that resistance members could purchase or barter for additional supplies, or bribe officials to turn a blind eye to their activities. Yet, of all the items delivered by the carpetbaggers, few were more valuable than the radios, compact transmitters that allowed resistance cells to coordinate operations across hundreds of miles. A single radio could transform an isolated group into part of a continent-wide network, capable of coordinating sabotage operations timed to support Allied military advances. In August 1944, the 801st Bombardment Group was redesignated as the 492nd Bombardment Group, absorbing personnel and aircraft from another unit that had suffered severe losses in conventional bombing operations. This reorganization brought fresh crews to Harrington Field, but it also meant integrating new personnel into operations that remained as secretive and dangerous as ever. By September, the liberation of France was well underway, and the full-scale carpetbagger missions over French territory ended on the night of September 16th. But rather than marking the end of their dangerous work, this represented a dramatic shift in operations that would prove even more challenging than their earlier missions. With France largely in Allied hands, the carpetbaggers began to fly to other countries more frequently, which would often require flying much deeper into enemy territory over increasingly hostile airspace. These missions pushed both aircraft and crews to their absolute limits, with some flights lasting up to 10 hours as they navigated across the breadth of Nazi-controlled Europe. Before takeoff, only the pilots and navigators would know which country they'd be heading for. The rest of the crew were kept in the dark. The carpetbaggers even began flying missions over heavily defended Germany itself. There, where no friendly resistance groups waited to provide guidance, the carpetbaggers began using faster A-26 aircraft. These twin-engine bombers could outrun many German night fighters and were better suited to the high-speed, low-altitude penetrations required over the Reich itself. The transition to new aircraft types added another layer of complexity to operations that were already pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Meanwhile, the missions to Scandinavia presented their own unique challenges. Here, the carpetbaggers quickly learned that their greatest enemies weren't just German fighters and anti-aircraft guns, but the unforgiving realities of low-altitude night flying over unfamiliar terrain. Navigator Hewitt Gomez experienced this firsthand during a mission to Norway in March 1945, when his crew was tasked with delivering supplies to resistance fighters hidden deep in the country's treacherous fjords. Flying at their usual low altitude to avoid German radar, Gomez's B-24 was threading its way through the narrow valleys when disaster nearly struck. Gomez later recalled, quote, "We had to fly into the fjords to make the drop, and I heard the bombardier say, 'Pull up, pull up.' A B-24's got 4 engines. You can't just get it to do that." The pilot fought the controls, desperately trying to gain altitude as the rocky walls of the fjord rushed past their wingtips. When they finally made it back to Harrington Field, the ground crew made a shocking discovery. Gomez remembered, quote, "We had tree limbs stuck in our aileron. A few feet lower, and we wouldn't have made it. We would have run into a mountain." Such near misses were becoming increasingly common as the carpetbaggers pushed deeper into enemy territory. The margins for error were razor thin when flying heavy bombers at altitudes that would challenge even fighter aircraft. Weather added another deadly variable. Sudden cloud cover could force navigators to rely entirely on dead reckoning, while unexpected headwinds could leave aircraft dangerously low on fuel for the return journey. By the time Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the carpetbaggers had flown a total of 1,860 sorties, delivering 20,495 containers and 11,174 packages of vital supplies to resistance forces across Western and Southwestern Europe in the 16 months since the operation started. More than 1,000 parachutists, the Joes and Josephines, had dropped through Joe holes into enemy territory. Overall, it's estimated that over 2/3 of carpetbagger missions were carried out successfully, an impressive rate considering what they involved. Nevertheless, the unit lost 25 B-24s to enemy action and accidents, with 8 more aircraft so badly damaged they were deemed unfit for further combat. What's more, 208 crew members either lost their lives or were listed as missing. The families of lost airmen faced a particularly cruel uncertainty. Unlike conventional bombing missions that took place during daylight hours with clear military objectives, carpetbagger crews who failed to return simply vanished into the night. Their relatives could be told only that, for example, their loved one had, quote, perished in air action at 3 a.m., a cryptic notification that left families wondering what kind of engagement could possibly have taken place at such an unusual hour. Yet there was also hope amid the losses. Many airmen listed as missing had actually parachuted to safety and were being hidden by the very resistance networks they'd been supplying. Before eventually making their way back to Allied lines, these men often spent months living in secret with French, Belgian, or Norwegian families who were more than willing to repay them for their bravery in carrying out the missions, keeping them safe until they were able to get back home. Upon return, the carpetbaggers were forbidden from telling anyone what they'd done. Before leaving their posts, each crew member was required to raise his right hand and swear an oath of secrecy that would last for 40 years. This often created bizarre and sometimes painful situations. When Hewitt Gomez tried to join the Air Force Reserve after the war, he was told there was no record of his ever being in the Air Force. The carpetbagger operations were so classified they'd been erased from official records. Similarly, many carpetbagger veterans found themselves unable to join the veterans of foreign wars because they couldn't provide details about their service that would verify their combat experience. Family relationships suffered under the burden of enforced silence. Children grew up never knowing exactly what their fathers had done during the war, aware only that it had been dangerous and important. Wives who had worried through long deployments remained in the dark about why their husbands sometimes woke from nightmares, or why certain sounds, like low-flying aircraft at night, could trigger unexpected reactions. When the operations were finally declassified in the 1980s, it marked the beginning of a remarkable period of recognition and reunion. Veterans who had carried their secrets alone for 4 decades could finally share their experiences, leading to annual reunions across the United States and Europe, where aging airmen could at last speak freely about their extraordinary service. Eugene Polinsky explained, quote, "I thought I'd forgotten all about the carpetbaggers. When I started going to reunions, I was meeting carpetbaggers I'd not known, and over these years we've become very close, and we keep telling each other stories, and we keep enduring each other's stories, no matter how many times we've heard them." Reflecting on the carpetbaggers' legacy, perhaps Bob Holstrom summed it up best, quote, "We never dropped a bomb at all. We did all humanitarian work. We supplied 350,000 underground people with whatever they needed to live with."